Have you ever been treated like a burden by the people you sacrificed everything for? Imagine losing the love of your life, then being told to just disappear by your own daughter-in-law, while your own son stays silent. This is the story of a father who gave his all, only to be pushed away when he needed them most. Welcome to our channel. Today's story is told from a father's perspective. Let's begin. I was born into a family that had very little, a small, humble home where the walls seemed to hold the weight of endless worries. Money was scarce, and every day was a battle just to make ends meet. From a very young age, I understood that if I wanted to survive, I couldn't rely on anyone else. I had to work hard, and I had to work hard every single day. My mornings would start before the sun rose. I'd deliver newspapers through cold streets, my hands numb from the chill, hoping to earn a few coins that would help feed my family. After school, I would rush to the market, carrying heavy bags and running errands for shopkeepers just to make a little extra money. There was never a moment to rest. The world didn't wait for me to be tired. Despite the hardship, I never complained. I carried a quiet hope in my heart, a dream that someday my life would be better. When my son was born, that hope turned into something fierce and unstoppable. He wasn't just a child to me, he was my purpose, my reason to keep fighting. I wanted him to have everything I never did, a home without hunger, a future filled with opportunities, a life where he wouldn't have to struggle like I did. But dreams cost money. And money was the one thing I didn't have enough of. School fees, books, uniforms, these were luxuries in my world, but I promised myself I would find a way. I took on every odd job I could find. Some days, I worked from dawn until late into the night, my body aching, my spirit drained. I skipped meals so he could eat. I gave away my last rupee so he could buy a notebook. I told myself it was worth every sacrifice, no matter how hard. There's one memory that stays with me, the day I sold my bicycle. That bike was everything to me when I was a boy. It was my freedom, my escape, my most prized possession. It was the thing that made me feel alive when life was otherwise so difficult. But when the school fees came due that year, I didn't hesitate. I took that bike to the market and sold it to a stranger for a few hundred rupees. I handed over that money without a second thought because it meant my son could stay in school. I remember walking home that day, the emptiness where my bike used to be felt like a part of me was missing. But when I saw my son studying, focused and hopeful, I felt a warmth inside that made the pain bearable. I told myself that sacrifice was just a small price to pay for his future. I would give up anything, even my own happiness, if it meant he could have a better life. Life didn't get easier with time, if anything, the responsibilities only grew heavier. But I had a vision in my heart, one that kept me going every single day. I didn't want my son to grow up in a home filled with worry the way I had. I wanted him to feel safe, to wake up without hearing his parents whispering about overdue bills or rationing food. I wanted to build something solid for him, a foundation strong enough to carry his dreams. I worked hours most people wouldn't dare to. While others spent their weekends resting, I was out doing double shifts. I'd wake up before sunrise and come back when the world was fast asleep. Overtime became my normal, and holidays were just another day to earn. I saved every rupee like it was my last, not for luxuries, not for myself, but for a better life for my boy. Every decision I made with him in mind. When others my age were thinking of retiring early or buying new things, I was thinking about how to buy a home, not for me, but for my family. After years of saving, cutting corners, and denying myself the smallest comforts, I finally bought a house. A small, modest home, but it was ours. I can still remember the way my son looked at his own room for the first time, the joy in his eyes, the way he ran across the floor. That moment alone made all the sleepless nights worth it. Education was never up for debate in our home. I didn't care if I had to borrow money, sell belongings, or work myself to the bone, my son was going to get the best schooling I could afford. I stood in long lines at school offices, negotiated fees with principals, and made sure he had every book, every uniform, every pencil he needed. He never knew what it cost me, the meals I skipped, the shoes I didn't buy, the winter jacket I wore for 3 years straight. And I never told him. I didn't want him to feel the weight of those sacrifices. I wanted him to walk forward without looking back, without knowing how many nights I sat alone wondering if I was doing enough. Even when I was sick, even when my body begged me to rest, I kept going. There were days I worked through fever, limping on sore feet, coughing through long shifts, but I never missed a day. Because deep down, I believed that one day, all this struggle would bloom into something beautiful for him. That he would grow up remembering not the things we didn't have, but the love, the effort, and the life I tried to build for him, one day at a time. The day my son told me he wanted to get married, my heart swelled with a strange mix of joy and nostalgia. I saw a spark in his eyes, that same innocent hope he had as a little boy when he used to dream out loud about his future. I still remember sitting with him, listening as he described the girl he loved. He spoke of her kindness, her laughter, how she understood him like no one else did. As a father, I couldn't have asked for more. I smiled through misty eyes and said, "If she brings you happiness, she brings me happiness too." When the wedding day finally came, I stood silently in a corner of the hall watching him, my boy, now a man, holding her hand and stepping into a new life. I thought back to the days when I used to carry him on my shoulders, to the nights I stayed up sewing buttons back onto his school shirt, to the sacrifices I had made so that this day, this beautiful day, could arrive without worry. I felt a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't shout, just sits in the heart like a warm ember. I welcomed my daughter-in-law into our home not as a guest, not even just as my son's wife, but as my own daughter. I made sure her favorite foods were cooked. I spoke to her gently, gave her space, respected her decisions. In my heart, I truly believed we were becoming a complete family, stitched together not by blood alone, but by understanding and care. I wanted her to feel safe here, to feel like this was her home too. I did everything I could to make life easier for the two of them. I took on the responsibility of paying their mortgage, not just once, but month after month. I didn't want them to worry about bills while trying to build a future. I had spent my whole life working, saving, sacrificing, and now, I told myself, it was their turn to live with some ease. My son was also trying to grow his business, and I knew how unstable those first years could be. So without being asked, I quietly supported him financially. I would send money at the start of every month, making sure he had something to fall back on. Sometimes I would hear the tension in his voice on the phone and pretend not to notice, simply asking, "Do you need anything?" He never had to ask, I was always already there. Even when my own needs grew with age, my back ached more, my energy dipped, I never hesitated. I never thought twice about pouring everything I had into their lives. I used to sit alone some nights in the living room, after they had gone to bed, thinking to myself, this is what peace feels like. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had done what I always promised myself I would do, I had carried my family across the storm and brought them into the calm. In those quiet moments, I used to imagine my wife, God rest her soul, smiling down from above. I'd whisper to her, "Look, they're okay. We did it." I believed with all my heart that the pain, the struggle, the endless sacrifices were worth it because I had built something lasting. A family. A home. A future. I never kept count of what I gave. I never held it over their heads. I never even mentioned it, because to me, being a father meant giving without expecting anything in return. That's what love meant to me. And I truly believed, foolish or not, that love would be returned one day, in kindness, in care, in understanding. But life, as I would soon learn, doesn't always reward quiet sacrifices. Nothing in life prepares you for the moment you lose the person you built your entire world with. She wasn't just my wife, she was my friend, my anchor, the one person who understood the silence in my words and the worry in my eyes without me having to say a thing. We had weathered every storm together, poverty, struggle, hard days, and long nights. Through all of it, her presence had been my strength. And then one day, she was gone. Just like that. No warning, no time to say goodbye. One moment she was there beside me, and the next, I was left staring at an empty chair at the dinner table. I didn't know how to breathe after she passed. The house that once echoed with laughter and the sound of her bangles now felt painfully silent. I would still wake up early out of habit, half expecting to see her preparing tea in the kitchen. But the kitchen was cold, untouched. Everything about the house felt different, heavier, hollow. There were days I caught myself talking to her photo, forgetting for a moment that she wasn't coming back. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't just come in tears, it comes in waves of silence, in the unbearable weight of everyday things. I started feeling lost in my own home. The loneliness crept in slowly, and soon, even the smallest tasks felt impossible. I didn't want much, just someone to sit beside me, someone to ask if I had eaten, someone to tell me I wasn't alone. In those days, I looked to my son and daughter-in-law. I believed they would be my emotional support. I had done so much for them, but now, all I needed was their presence, a kind word, a gentle hand on the shoulder, maybe a moment where we could sit together and remember her. I thought they would understand how broken I felt, how deeply the loss had carved into me. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that family was meant to catch you when life knocks you down. I didn't need grand gestures. I didn't expect daily sympathy. I just hoped that, once in a while, they'd sit with me and ask, "Are you okay, Baba?" I hoped they'd notice how my eyes stayed fixed on her photograph for hours, how I sometimes forgot to eat, how I lingered in our old bedroom longer than I should. I was surrounded by people, yet I had never felt more alone. Every part of me was aching for comfort, for the kind of warmth only family could offer. But comfort never came. That evening is one I will never forget, not because something grand happened, but because something inside me quietly broke beyond repair. It had been a long, heavy day. My body ached the way it often does now, and my heart still carried the quiet ache of my wife's absence. As the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the living room, I sat quietly, hoping for a warm plate of food. Not because I demanded it. Not because I felt entitled. But because I was tired, and hungry, and I didn't have the strength that evening to fix something for myself. I thought it was a simple request, nothing more than a father asking his own family for a basic kindness. So I called out gently, with hesitation in my voice, "Beta, is there something to eat?" What I received in return was not an answer, it was an explosion. Without even looking at me, my daughter-in-law snapped. Her voice, sharp and bitter, cut through the room like a blade. "Why don't you just disappear?" At first, I thought I had misheard her. Surely, no one could say such a thing, not to a father, not to an elder, not to someone who had done nothing but give. But her tone was not one of confusion or frustration. It was laced with resentment, as if my very existence in that home had become a burden she could no longer carry. I turned slowly to look at my son, hoping, no, begging, that he would say something. Anything. A word of defense, a gesture of protest, a simple acknowledgement of how wrong that moment was. But he stood there, motionless. Eyes low, lips sealed. His silence echoed louder than her words. And in that stillness, I felt something deeper than pain, I felt abandoned. This was the same son I had carried on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk. The same boy whose fever I had stayed up all night watching. The one for whom I sold my bicycle, for whom I skipped meals, for whom I worked day and night just so he would never feel the weight of the world the way I once had. And now, here he was, letting me be humiliated in the home I had built, not just with bricks, but with sacrifice. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. My voice was too tired, my heart too full. I simply stood there, watching a piece of my soul fracture as the people I loved most treated me like I didn't matter, like I was a nuisance, like I was disposable. And though no one else saw it, that night, something quietly shifted inside me. That night, after the shouting had faded and the house fell into silence, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, the same bed my wife and I had shared for decades. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. My stomach was still empty, but my heart, it was heavier than ever. My thoughts wandered, unwillingly, to the past, to the long journey that brought us here. I saw my younger self in flashes, working 2 shifts in a single day, coming home with aching feet but a smiling face, just to catch a glimpse of my son before he fell asleep. I remembered standing in front of his school's fee counter with barely enough money in my pocket, and I remembered selling my old bicycle, the only thing I truly owned back then, so he wouldn't miss a single day of class. I remembered how, when he had measles as a child, I sat beside him the whole night, wiping his forehead, whispering lullabies his mother used to sing. I remembered how I skipped buying new clothes for myself every Eid so he could wear something nice and never feel small among his friends. Every decision I ever made, I made with him in mind: how to feed him, how to clothe him, how to give him a future I never had. And now, I sat in that same house, the one I paid for, the one I kept running with my own 2 hands, being treated as if I was some leftover responsibility. I asked myself again and again, is this how love dies? Not suddenly, but slowly, suffocated under the weight of convenience and selfishness. I kept turning it over in my mind: how did we go from bedtime stories and warm embraces to cruel silence and bitter words? Had I failed him as a father, or had he simply changed into someone I no longer recognized? It was in those quiet, painful hours that a new thought emerged, not out of anger, but clarity. Maybe the problem wasn't just in what they had become, but in what I had allowed. Maybe I had drawn no lines because I believed that love didn't need boundaries. But now, I realized that even a father must sometimes step back, even a heart full of love must learn to protect itself. I could no longer be the man who gave endlessly while being quietly pushed aside. I wasn't looking for repayment, never had, but I also couldn't ignore the disrespect, the disregard, the sheer coldness with which I was treated. Something had to change. Not just in them, but in me. The morning after that unforgettable night, I sat with my cup of tea, though it tasted more like hot water than comfort. My heart felt bruised, but it was no longer confused. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't wrestling with questions. I had made up my mind. I walked into the living room, where my son was scrolling through his phone and my daughter-in-law was bustling around in the kitchen, her back to me. My voice didn't tremble, but it didn't rise either. I spoke calmly, perhaps too calmly for what I was about to say. I will no longer be paying the mortgage, I said. My son looked up, confused, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. And I will no longer be transferring money to your business account. Silence. At first, he laughed nervously, waiting for me to explain that I was joking, or maybe that I had found another way to help instead. But I didn't. I sat down, looked him in the eye, and continued. I didn't raise you with the hope that one day you would treat me like I'm invisible. I didn't build this life so I could be shouted at in my old age like I'm unwanted. I've done my part. More than my part. But from this day forward, I will not buy respect with my money. If I am to be part of this family, it will be with dignity. Otherwise, I'd rather eat plain bread alone with peace than dine in a house full of bitterness. The words hung heavy in the air. My son's face flushed: anger? Embarrassment? I couldn't tell. My daughter-in-law didn't say a word, but I noticed how she stopped moving in the kitchen. For the first time, they were both quiet. But this time, I didn't mistake that silence for shame. I knew better. They weren't sorry I had been hurt. They were shocked that I had finally stood up for myself. There was pushback, of course. They called me stubborn. They said I was overreacting. My son even tried guilt. He asked how I could do this to him after all these years. But I had heard enough. I had given enough. And I had lost too much of myself trying to keep peace where there was no respect. So I stood firm. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I simply stopped. No more checks. No more silent support. No more looking the other way. For once, I chose myself. Not out of revenge, but out of a deep, overdue respect for my own worth. At first, they thought I was bluffing. Maybe they assumed my pride would fade after a few days, that I would eventually come back around with folded hands and offer to pay the next bill like always. Maybe they believed I couldn't bear to see them struggle. And for a brief moment, I almost wanted to. Because despite everything, despite the cruel words, despite the humiliation, I'm still a father. A father's heart is a strange thing. It aches even for the people who break it. But this time, I stayed firm. And reality, harsh and undeniable, began to creep in. The first storm came quietly, a mortgage payment bounced. Then a second. And by the third, the warning letters began to arrive. I saw them stuffed into drawers, hidden under magazines, as if ignoring them would make them disappear. I didn't say a word. Then came the phone calls. Collectors. Bank managers. Business partners. My son, once so full of confidence, now avoided phone calls like they were venom. He paced the hallway with tired eyes, mumbling excuses I had never taught him to make. The proud young man who once talked about expanding his business into 3 cities couldn't even pay rent for his tiny office anymore. The car, oh, the car he loved so much, was the next to go. He had leased it under his name, but I had always quietly sent the monthly payments. Without them, the dealership repossessed it in broad daylight, right in front of the neighbors. I saw the shame on his face when he stepped outside and saw the empty driveway. For a second, I thought he'd look up at me through the window and understand. But he didn't. The house, once filled with artificial cheer and polite distance, became eerily quiet. My daughter-in-law, who used to wear designer shoes just to go to the grocery store, now wore the same clothes 3 days in a row. She stopped putting on makeup. She stopped speaking to me altogether. I heard her crying one night in their room, loud enough for the whole house to hear, but neither of them came to check on me anymore. I was a ghost, the same ghost she had wished would just disappear. Their arguments became routine. Muffled shouts behind closed doors. Sometimes she blamed him, saying he'd been foolish to rely so much on an old man's wallet. Sometimes he blamed her, for pushing too hard, for never appreciating what they had. But in truth, they both knew. They both felt it. The foundation they had built their comfort on wasn't a job, or a business, or their own effort. It had been me. And when that foundation stepped back, the entire house began to shake. The fridge started to look emptier. Leftovers stretched into next-day meals. Their once glowing, lively dinner table turned into a silent corner of the house where no one sat. The child, my grandson, started asking innocent questions that made their shame feel even sharper. Why don't we go out to eat anymore? Why did the internet stop working? Why did Mama throw her phone on the floor? My heart ached every time I heard his little voice. He didn't understand what was happening. And maybe that was the hardest part. Children never ask to be caught in the storm, but they always feel the cold winds first. And through all of this, I said nothing. Not because I was cold. Not because I didn't care. But because I had cared too much, for too long, and been treated like I was nothing. So I stayed in my room, I made my own tea, I ate simple meals quietly, and I watched. I watched them unravel. I watched them finally carry the weight I had borne silently for years. And I watched them begin to understand the difference between having and being given. They had built their lives on the back of my love, my labor, and my silence. Now they were learning the hard way what life looked like without all three. It happened quietly. No grand gestures. No rehearsed speeches. Just one evening, after weeks of tension and silence, my son knocked on my door, not with arrogance, not with demands, but with eyes I hadn't seen in years. Eyes that looked tired. Humbled. Human. He stepped inside and stood there for a moment, saying nothing. I was seated on the edge of my bed, folding my shawl, pretending not to notice how his hands trembled slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. The proud young man who once thought he had the world in his palm now stood before me like the little boy I once carried home in the rain when he scraped his knee and cried out for his father. "Abba," he finally whispered, his voice barely holding itself together. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He sank to his knees beside me, and when he looked up, I saw something I had longed for, not just regret, but recognition. The kind of understanding that only comes when life has knocked the wind out of your certainty. "I was wrong," he said. "I don't even know where to begin, or how to say it properly. But I need to say it, even if I'm too late." Still, I said nothing. He needed to keep going, to let it out. He lowered his head, the weight of guilt pulling him down like gravity. "You gave up everything for us, Abba. Your youth, your comforts, your dreams, everything. And his voice cracked, I let her speak to you like that. I stood there and said nothing. I failed as a son." A long silence filled the room. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes your heartbeat sound louder than it should. "I thought I was strong," he continued. "I thought I was building my own life, being independent. But the truth is, everything I had, every success, every comfort, it all came from you. From the sacrifices you made silently. From the things you never boasted about." I could feel my throat tighten, but I didn't let the tears come. "Not yet." He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and placed his hand over mine. "I'm sorry, Abba. I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have right now. If you can forgive me, if you're willing. I want to fix this. I want to earn back your trust. Not because I need your money. But because I miss my father." And there it was. The words I had once prayed to hear, in the dark nights after my wife's death, when I sat alone and wondered where I had gone wrong. They didn't come wrapped in perfection. But they came soaked in honesty. In humility. In the kind of pain that breaks a man just enough to rebuild him properly. For the first time in a long while, I saw my son again, not the grown man who had forgotten his roots, but the child who used to run to me with scraped elbows and wide eyes. He was back. Maybe not completely. Maybe not perfectly. But back enough to know the road ahead would look different. Time passed slowly after that night. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore, it was filled with something fragile, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. I was cautious, yes. Years of pain and disappointment had built walls inside me that wouldn't come down overnight. But something deep inside told me this was the moment to start rebuilding. I didn't rush. I didn't pretend everything was fixed. Instead, I took small steps, listening more, speaking carefully, watching closely. And I made sure to set boundaries, clear and firm, so that respect would no longer be something I begged for, but something we all gave freely. "No more silence when I'm hurt," I told them once. "No more taking without gratitude. We must honor each other if this family is to stand." We talked about the sacrifices that had been made, those invisible threads holding us together through the toughest storms. I reminded them, gently but firmly, that love isn't just about giving, it's about appreciating, understanding, and standing side by side, even when it's hard. I saw a new light in my son's eyes then, a mix of humility and determination. He wanted to prove that he could be the man I had raised him to be, not just in words but in actions. And my daughter-in-law, though still distant, began to soften too, realizing that family is not a place to take from, but a home to nurture. We began rebuilding, not just a house, but the trust that had been broken. Slowly, piece by piece, the walls filled with laughter again. The shared meals were no longer just about food, but about connection. The arguments didn't disappear overnight, but they changed, they became conversations instead of battles. I learned that forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. That strength isn't in never falling, but in choosing to rise, again and again. And most of all, I realized that family, with all its flaws and fractures, is worth fighting for. Worth protecting. Worth loving, even when it hurts. Thank you for listening to this story of struggle, pain, and ultimately, hope. It reminds us all how important it is to value and respect the sacrifices our parents make for us. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Your support means everything to us. Until next time, take care and cherish your family.